You're a Vietnam vet, welcome home. My name is Bob Jacobs, and I'm the chairman of the JWV National Vietnam Veterans Committee. On the first program last week, I did talk about the proposed exhibit at the museum and the Vietnam exhibit at the museum and things of that nature. But at the risk of repeating myself, I'm not going to. So if you want to know more about the Vietnam Veterans Committee and or the exhibit, you should have Mike Rugel's address. You can send him a request in Washington, and he will put you in contact with me. At this point, though, I would like to introduce a good friend of mine, Mike Berman, who's a past national commander of the Jewish War Veterans, and he is currently the president of the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. Took years to say that right. Mike?
Well, welcome to the approximately 150 people who are here today on this panel. First of all, I'd like to thank Bob Jacobs, Sheldon Goldberg, and Mike Rugel for making sure that we put this together. We have a tremendous panel of veterans speaking from their various experiences, and I welcome you all to the museum. As you know, we're putting together the museum exhibit of the Vietnam experience, or the experience during the Vietnam era. That's coming along nicely. With any luck, we'll have that open for Veterans Day. And for any luck, we'll all be able to attend it on Veterans Day. So please, if you want to support that exhibit, money counts. As Ed Asner once said, money talks, BS walks. So welcome, and thank you for joining the panel. With that, Mike Rugel's going to silence me and get me off and I'll be able to have a cigarette and a medicinal pot.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Okay, now that he's disappeared. All right, now I would like to turn the microphone over to our moderator. I mistakenly called him Master of Ceremonies last week.
That's okay.
You want to be the master? That sounds like you're a rapper. Okay. Sheldon Goldberg, who is a retired Air Force officer, and he is the head docent of the museum. I think he's the only one right now, but that makes it head docent anyhow. And I will be back later on as a panelist, so I will just mute myself for now. Sheldon, take it away.
Okay, thank you much, Bob.
Sure.
For those that don't know me, Sheldon Goldberg, I'm a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, and I am the docent/historian at the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. And I guess I'll throw in a little advertisement here. So if and when we start opening, I think we are open, and you get a group together and you'd like to get a tour, give Mike Rugel a call. Mike Rugel will call me, and if everything works out right, we'll come down and I'll be the one that'll be giving you the tour. The rules of engagement for today are going to be similar to what we did last week. If any of you attended last week's panel, I'm going to give just a very brief history of the Vietnam War, sort of walk you through a timeline. And as we go to the period where one of our panelists served, we're going to turn it over to him and let him tell you what he did in the war, how it affected him, and so on. And once we complete the go round with the 5 panelists that we have, we're going to return again to the same order and have each one of us talk about what it was like being Jewish, whether it impacted them in any religious way, whether it had anything that got them involved with the squadron or the wing or the unit that they were with. And after that, we will hopefully have some time for questions and answers. Bob Jacobs will sort of monitor that, or Mike Rugel will be monitoring that. So if you do, please put your question in under the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll work from there. So when World War II ended in Asia in September of 1945, France's attempt to regain former colonies in Indochina led to what has been called the First Vietnamese War at the beginning of 1946. So while we complain about being in war for 20 years in Afghanistan, the Vietnamese have been at war for something like 30 some odd years. But Anyway, within a few years, China and the Soviet Union had recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and began supplying them with arms. What had then been a guerrilla war became, by 1950, a full-fledged conventional war. That year, the U.S. identified the Viet Minh as a communist threat and stepped up military assistance to France for their operations against the Viet Minh, as they were called. In May 1954, the French troops were defeated by the Viet Minh forces at Dien Bien Phu. That defeat led to the end of French rule in Indochina. And 5 years later, in May 1959, the North Vietnamese began to build a supply route through Laos and Cambodia to South Vietnam in an effort to support the guerrilla attacks against the government of South Vietnam. That route became known to all as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. As we move on, we find that in 1959, the first US soldiers were killed in South Vietnam when guerrillas attacked their living quarters near Saigon. These were members of the military advisory and assistance group that was there at that time. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy sends helicopters and 400 Green Berets to South Vietnam and authorizes secret operations against the Viet Cong. Now, I actually got there in 1963 the first time. I was flying the C-124 and the 141s later, combat cargo aircraft, and brought in supplies. And at the very beginning there, it was toilet paper, typing paper, and typewriters. Even brought a refrigerator in and filing cabinets up to Tak Ly at one point. But I did that 23 times between 1963 and 1967. In 1964, in August, the USS Manox was allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese patrol torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, leading President Johnson to call for airstrikes of North Vietnamese patrol boat bases. 2 U.S. aircraft were shot down. In August of 64, again, the attacks in the Gulf of Tonkin spur Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which authorized the president, and I quote, to take all necessary measures, including the use of armed forces against any aggressor in the conflict. February 1965, President Johnson orders the bombing of targets in North Vietnam in Operation Flaming Dart. In March of 65, Johnson again launches a 3-year campaign of sustained bombing of targets in North Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Operation Rolling Thunder. The same month, U.S. Marines land on the beaches near Da Nang, South Vietnam, as the first American combat troops to enter Vietnam. In 1966, President Johnson calls for 50,000 more ground troops to be sent to Vietnam. And in August of 65, in Operation Starlight, some 5,500 Marines strike against the 1st Viet Cong Regiment in the first major ground offensive by U.S. forces in Vietnam. Moving up to November of that year, nearly 300 Americans were killed and hundreds more were wounded in the first large-scale battle of the war, the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley. Again in 66, troop numbers increased now to 400,000. And in June of that year, American aircraft attacked targets in Hanoi and Haiphong. In 1967, US troop numbers stationed in Vietnam increased to 500,000. And this is the year that we find Jerry Alperstein, United States Navy, out in the Gulf of Tonkin. So Jerry,
yes,
that's what you experienced.
Okay, the best way for me to talk about it is to tell you what the Navy was doing off the coast of Vietnam. The major unit out there is Task Force 77, which those of us who served in Task Force 77 also refer to it as the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club, but it was no yacht club. Most of the Navy was in either Yankee Station or Dixie Station. Dixie Station was about 20 to 25 miles off of the coast of South Vietnam. It consisted of one aircraft carrier and anywhere from 2 to 4 destroyers running, protecting the aircraft carrier. Yankee Station was bigger. It had 3 aircraft carriers. And again, each carrier had 2 to 4 destroyers running with it. Also, one of the destroyers was actually from the Royal Australian Navy when I was there, the Hobart. And also on Yankee Station, we had another ship out there that was not part of Task Force 77. It was part of the Soviet Navy. It was the Russian trawler spy ship, basically. And I'll get back to that a little later. Most of what we did, I was on a destroyer, is we ran with the aircraft carriers. It's called plane guarding. Every time they ran flight operations, we all had to speed up to 28 knots, and we were there to pick up anybody whose plane fell into the drink. In addition to protecting the aircraft carriers 24/7. And then there were also auxiliary ships, oilers, and supply ships that we would have to replenish every so many days. Because you can only have, you burn up fuel running, and you always have to replenish supplies. Okay. Now, here is an interesting story that I'm sure nobody knows about, and this is something that had to have been approved by President Johnson. One day when we're out on station, and we were ordered to have our sonar active, pinging a way, and I would assume the Soviet trawler had its sonar going, whether it was active or passive, I have no idea. But about 300 yards from my ship, one of our submarines surfaces. I happen to know the head of our sonar gang back then. I still know him today. We meet at reunions, and they picked up absolutely nothing. That must have caused a lot of problems back in Moscow when that information got back to them. But it's an interesting story. A destroyer would stay out on station 5 or 6 weeks. You have to understand there are 250 people on a ship, 400 feet long, 41 feet at its widest point, and 2/3 of the space is boiler rooms and engine rooms. So every 5 or 6 weeks, it was either to Naval Station Subic Bay in Luzon in the Republic of the Philippines, Kaohsiung, the major port of Taiwan, and once we went to Hong Kong. Now, that was most of the time, and most of it was like routine stuff. But you've heard Sheldon was talking about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That was not the only supply route from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. The other was the coast, where boats with supplies would be sent. To intercept and sink those boats was Operation Sea Dragon. One cruiser and 2 destroyers at a time were assigned to Operation Sea Dragon, and my ship, the USS Charles R. Ware DD865, was assigned there, and on those attacks, we were often on those ships. We were often less than a mile from the coast of North Vietnam. Sometimes the North Vietnamese military would trail or shadow the boats along the coastal road with artillery. So sometimes we were fired on. Now some of you are going to laugh at this, but when I went into battle, and I did go into battle, I went into battle with a telephone. Now I see Sheldon is smiling. Well, you have to understand that on a modern naval ship, one person fires guns and everybody else does something else. And I manned a telephone on the bridge. Now, in fact, on a U.S. Navy ship, when it goes into battle, more people are doing absolutely nothing. And that's what you want them to do. Those are the damage control teams. They sit in the passageways with their fire hoses and axes and all sorts of other equipment, first aid equipment, whatever. And you want them doing nothing, because you got a problem if they have to do something. About 5 or 6 times we were fired on. One time that we were not was a night attack on a group of supply ships heading south. And one member of a damage control team, when he leaned against the bulkhead to sit down, flipped the switch that turned on the import deck lights on one side of the ship. So we were all lit up. Something the North Vietnamese, we don't know whether they had their guns there or not, but they didn't fire on us. They must have been a little confused about that. But one time they actually set a trap. They had, during the day, a large group of supply ships came out of a river heading south, and they had a load of guns shadowing it. And when we came in to attack it, we attacked. And then I was on the bridge, so I would hear everything. Our electronics technicians would report cross-slot radar bearing such and such. That was a fire control radar that the North Vietnamese used. And it would go on for less than a minute and then shut down, so we couldn't track in on it. And so we knew we were going to be fired on. But there were more than, well, it was approximately 1,000 rounds fired at the 3 U.S. ships. Once we saw how, and this was the one time I got a chance to command the whole attention of the bridge. I was on what is called the JC circuit, which is the communication circuits, the signal bridge, the radio room, the auxiliary radio room, and an additional extra line into the combat information center. So the signal bridge calls down to me, airburst, relative bearing 020. So in my master voice, I shout out, get the attention of everybody, airburst, relative bearing 020. And as soon as I finished, one of the internal loudspeaker systems on the ship, the 20MC, comes on, and Sonarman Kelly comes on and says, underwater explosion bearing something. And once the unit commander on the cruiser realized how many shells were being fired, we got an order to get out of there as fast as we could. The signal for that is using the phonetic alphabet, Romeo November. You just have to add the uniform in the middle, and you know what the order means. And of course, we weave back and forth. Now, in this retreat, I came within a tiny fraction of an inch of not being here today. We heard a projectile whistling through the air. Everything on the bridge got totally silent, and it flew right over us and splashed about 30 yards off of the port wing of the bridge. So it must have been 10, 15 feet above the ship. And had the gun been aimed a tiny fraction of an inch lower, somebody else would be here today telling you a story. And just one last thing. Many of you may have heard of Tiger Island. The North Vietnamese had a radar station there. So I guess once a month, a ship from Operation Sea Dragon was assigned to knock out the radar station on Tiger Island. My ship got it, so we knocked it out. And I'm sure by a month later, some other ship was assigned to knock out the the radar station on Tiger Island. Couple of we were supposed to be on a round the world tour, but this was 1967. You recall things got a little hot in June in the Middle East. Suez Canal closed, so we had to go back the way we came. You're actually looking at somebody who has actually set foot on Midway Island. And the worst thing, the most that I encountered on this trip was going home. We pulled out of San Francisco into fog for 20 hours. I was not on the watch bill at the time, so I got assigned to fog watch. Two people stand right in the front of the ship. One will wear the radio, the sound-powered phones, and the other has to listen for ship whistles, horns, fog horns, because the surface search radar, the ANSPS-10, didn't pick anything up within a half mile of the ship. And when you hear a foghorn, you know roughly the direction that a ship is in, but you have to hear it twice to know which direction it's heading. So that got a little scary. But anyway, that's about my trip to Vietnam and back.
Hey, thank you, Jerry.
Sheldon, if I may, before we go on to the next, if I may, I've been monitoring the chats, and somebody wrote, "Where do we ask questions?" I know you said to put it in the Q&A, which is down at the bottom of your page, people. That's where we would rather see the questions, and most of them will probably be not answered until later in the program. All right, I'm going to mute myself again, Sheldon.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Yeah. And Jerry, you might want to know I am a member of the Tonkin Gulf Yacht Club, and I'll get to that when I have my panel period.
Congratulations.
Okay, moving on. We find in February '67, U.S. aircraft are bombing Haiphong Harbor and North Vietnamese airfields, and I'm sure Dave will talk to you about the problem of not bombing the SAM sites. 1967 November, the Battle of Dak To in the Central Highlands. United States suffered some 1,800 casualties. This was not a fun war. April of '68, U.S. Marine garrison at Khe Sanh in South Vietnam withstands a massive siege by communist forces from the People's Army of North Vietnam for 77 days. Also in January, the Tet Offensive begins. The attacks shock U.S. officials and mark a turning point in the war and the beginning of a gradual U.S. withdrawal. February, March of '68, I see the battles of Hue and Saigon, and with an American and ARVN, that's the Army of Vietnam, victory. David, you were over there in 1968. Tell us what you saw and what you experienced.
Well, I was over there flying the F-105F Wild Weasels. Now, for those not familiar with the Wild Weasel mission, we were there to protect the strike force that was going north after the airfields, the factories, the bridges, and all the other things the North Vietnamese had to maintain their war. The Wild Weasels were there to protect this strike force because early in 1965, we lost our first F-4 to a SAM, an SA-2. And we suddenly realized that the Russians had provided the Vietnamese with a weapon that we weren't prepared to handle. From that point, the Air Force started a quick reaction capability with F-100Fs to try and get a capability into an airplane that could find the SAM sites, destroy them to protect the fleet. They went over there in November of 1965, got their first SAM site kill in December of 1965. But the problem with the F-100, I'm sorry if I didn't say it, these airplanes were F-100Fs, two-seaters. They couldn't keep up with the F-4s and the Thunder Chiefs, the F-105s. So we started a second program, which was to take the F-105 two-seater and turn it into the Wild Weasel. And that's the one I flew. Our job was, as I say, to go up there first in, to go after the SAM sites, find out where they were, destroy them when we could, and let the strike force know that we were there to help them. And then, of course, the other part of our term was last out. We would stay there until the strike force had completed its mission and came out. Unfortunately, and Sheldon alluded to this thing, we saw a lot of these SAM sites being built, but we could not touch them. McNamara and Johnson had set up a rule of engagement, among others, which said we can't go after a SAM site and kill the SAM site until it's up and operational. The reason being, they were afraid we might hurt some Russian or Chinese advisor who was helping the North Vietnamese build the site. So we lost a lot of people because we didn't get the fans or the SAM sites, the fan song, the SA2 in time. So essentially, this was the mission that we had through. It's actually the Rolling Thunder, the heavy part of Rolling Thunder started in the mid '67. I got over there in the beginning of '68 and stayed through '68 and went through a couple of bombing halts where we didn't. I think the 1st of March. The 1st of April, we couldn't go up into Hanoi anymore, but we were still having to fight the battle down below. But essentially, we were still bombing sites where we could and getting restrictions on where we couldn't bomb, which hurt the mission. And there's a documentary in which one of my friends was asked by Ollie North, could we have won the war sooner? And his answer was absolutely yes, if it weren't for what we called the Tuesday lunch bunch. This was the Johnson and McNamara every Tuesday lunch that sat down and decided what targets we could go after. Essentially, that's the mission that we had with the Wild Weasels. The strike force was in there going after the important targets with the restrictions we had on us. And we lost a lot of people, lost a lot of airplanes. In fact, 5 of the first 7 F-105 Wild Weasels that we sent over there were lost because of the tactics that had to be developed. Essentially, that's the mission. Sheldon, is there anything else that I left out that you might want me to add to it?
No, not really. I think you hit it. You hit it pretty much all. But we'll have time. I mean, there'll be some questions later. I'm sure that you'll be able to address.
Okay, happy to answer the questions. By the way, the reason we got over there in February, late February, was because, as a friend of mine calls it, and I'll be careful how I use the word, there was the Pueblo, the letter P blank, blank, blank up, because the North Vietnamese or the North Koreans took our Pueblo, and a bunch of us were getting ready to leave Nellis from the Wild Weasel School and got detoured for a 6-week tour through North Korea. Actually, it was a 4-week tour through North Korea at Osan in case another war started in North Korea. So this was, again, part of the Southeast Asia mission that many of us had over there.
Thank you, Dave. As Dave just said, on the 1st of March in 1968, President Johnson halted the bombing of North Vietnam north of the 20th parallel. And the bombing, of course, kept on below that. But on the 31st of October of 1968, the president halted all bombing of North Vietnam. And so we entered a period of a bombing pause that lasted until 1970. So between 1969 and 1972, the Nixon administration now gradually reduced the number of U.S. forces in South Vietnam from 549,000 in 1969 to 69,000 in 1972. And that brings us then to the period here where Alan Falk was up there in I-Corps, I believe you said. Alan, tell us what your experience was.
That's correct. I was a fresh Marine captain only because I had very cooperative draft board and let me go from high school through college for 4 years, continued on into Rutgers Law School, and then went in, got to choose between the Army, Navy, and the Marine Corps. Army, Navy, and the Air Force required a 4-year enlistment to be a legal officer. Marine Corps said no problem, 3 years. So I went with them. But the catch was you also had to qualify as an infantry platoon commander, as well as a legal officer. So I got shipped in 69, about mid-69, right up to 1st Division, which was still dug in, basically right above northwest of Da Nang, holding off, anything coming south of there. And by that point, the North had built the super highway through the jungle into Laos and was coming down with a lot of supplies. And the big fear was they were going to wheel to the left and cut off Da Nang, and there was going to be a big battle there, which did not occur at any time that I was there or even later on. But it was always an extremely active battleground. We were stationed on Hill 372, which was, again, just northwest way up in the jungle hill mountain ridge, just short of Laos, and a lot of traffic coming through there, a lot of attacks coming down out of the jungle to try and wipe out the Marine base. It held the whole time I was there, certainly not because of me, but there was an awful lot of action. We were constantly target for rockets. In fact, we were on the gun target line between the battleship New Jersey and later the cruiser Indianapolis, which replaced it, the new one, and the whole range of rockets that coming over the reverse slope of the mountain range coming out of the jungle, basically big B-40 rockets, mostly just showering all over the cantonment. A lot of casualties, a lot of close encounters, but we held, and the action seemed to move south of there. They never could wheel around and take out Da Nang, because with the air base and the seaport and the Air Force base, if Da Nang had fallen, that really would have been it probably for the rest of the country. So a lot of war stories. I was just happy to be there and survive. I never did have to take out a provisional platoon, although a lot of us really did. And you were just told, okay, you got a bunch of cooks, clerks, and truck drivers who are ready to go. You got one seasoned NCO, and you're in command. You got to go get them. There was quite a bit of that. We were all well trained. Fortunately, never happened to me, and the war moved on.
Alan, you mentioned on the initial interview there that you were involved in the, I guess, trial of 3 murder cases. Was that? Oh yeah. Was that where you were stationed at the time up on that hill? Or?
Oh yes. When I went in to the Marine Corps, I was out of law school, but went right into the Marine Corps. Never tried a tractor ticket, and I did just have a stop first at Camp Pendleton before I went over, because they didn't want to ship inexperienced officers. And once you were a JAG officer, instead of going to first lieutenant, you went from second lieutenant to captain. So they put me at Pendleton for a while. My wife came out to join me there. I couldn't believe how fortunate I was to be at Pendleton. We would drive up at night and go up to the one of the TV shows, or Nixon compound at Camp Clemente, wherever was right off base there, and there was Mexico South. A wonderful life. I had to do some trials there. I did one trial, and they assigned me to the defense section. I tried the clerk of a payroll operation, and he was charged with counterfeiting a signature on back of a check and cashing it. And he was court-martialed, and I was assigned to defend him. And he denied it, and there really wasn't much evidence. Everything turned on the signature. And I asked around for some of the guys I knew in the CID, where can I find a good expert on handwriting? They told me about the sheriff and the expert up there in the next county. So you had to stand a lot of OD duty. They strap on the 45, and they give you a sedan and a driver, and that's it for a couple of days. And when I had the next OD, and I had a couple hours, I told the driver, take me up to the courthouse up there. On a weekday, I just walked in with a 45 and said, I need your handwriting guy up there. And they said, go see him. It's right in there. I walked in, told him the story, gave him the file. He looked at it and he said, well, Captain, I can't tell you that your client definitely did not sign that, but I can tell you that I can definitely not say he definitely did beyond a reasonable doubt. So I took a statement from him, went back, said, we want a trial, called him as a witness, had a court-martial board of a couple of officers and seasoned warrant officers, a couple of NCOs, and they found him not guilty. And I was really feeling great about that. Next thing I know, I got orders to 1st Marine Division in Vietnam. And off I go. So that's how I wound up in Vietnam. But
don't know whether that was a promotion or a punishment.
Both. But when it was all over, I was very happy, very proud to serve with the 1st. We got hit all the time. The reverse slope the other way was nothing but incoming rockets. Like I said, on the gun target line, when the cruiser or the battleship went off, it was like being under a freight train driving overhead all the time. And that was all crashing out there. And the other way was the B-40s coming in and just hitting everywhere. And it was all pot luck. The captain in charge of the brig that I was were in heavy combat, and they took him off and said, you just run the brig, you'll be fine. I went there one day. He had been blown up and killed the day before. We had a big supply building. They took a kid that had been in a platoon a little too long, was all shaky, said, you had enough. They gave him the clerk. He slept in the supply building. I went there a couple days later. Rocket hit there. He was killed. So it was just, you never knew. These rockets were flying left and right. If you were lucky, none of them were near you. If you were unlucky, that was it. So then I had some more interesting trials there and such. And I finally was done, and they sent me to down to Camp Lejeune and then out.
Yeah, the more I hear about the grunts on the ground, the more I was glad I joined the Air Force, believe me. Hey, Bob, I'm going to save you for last. You were there in the same time as I was. So I guess it's my turn here. And my combat experience was really one of luck and being in the right place at the right time. It started as I was getting ready to graduate from the University of Wisconsin, where I was on a graduate Air Force approved scholarship, hopefully to be an intelligence officer. And I got a little white card from military personnel that said, no, I was going to go to F4 training at George and to Southeast Asia at Da Nang. So off I went to California, settled my family, and then there was the standard round trip to Eglin for deep sea survival, Davis Mountain Air Force Base for radar lead-in training, and to George Air Force Base for a number of months to check out in the F4. And one thing I learned when I started flying in the Air Force was that I was going to learn enough about the airplane to never let a pilot kill me. And I did exactly that. By the time I got to George to begin training, I'd already had 9 hours in the F4. So when my training was all over, I really felt that the F4 and myself were one. In the class that I was in, I was one of the first classes that were training navigators to be backseaters, weapon systems officers in the Air Force. The F4 had full controls in the back, and it was primarily there for pilots. And they would use the pilots to spend a tour in the back seat, and then they could upgrade and become front seaters. And the problem was pilots didn't do so well in the back seat because they wanted to fly. They didn't want to be weapon systems operators and that sort of stuff. So they started using navigators. There might have also been a shortage of pilots at the time. I really don't know. The pilot I had through training was great. He kept talking. Primarily, one thing he kept saying was that night fighter pilots and night did not mix. And I didn't quite understand it until the second from last mission of the night phase, which was the last phase of training, when the crew in front of us, about 20 minutes ahead of us on the route going out to the range, pressed too low on the range, and both of them were killed. And that kind of stuck with me for a while. So in May, I get to Ubon. My orders were changed from Da Nang to Ubon in Thailand just a couple of days before I was leaving. And when I got there with 2 other navigators, I don't remember exactly how this happened, but the first one was told he was going to go to the 25th Tactical Fighter Squadron. This was the squadron with Loran system that they used for bombing. The other one was told he was going to the 435th Fighter Squadron, which was one of the first squadrons, I think, to use laser bombing techniques at the time. And he looked at me and said, I was going to the 497th. And at first that didn't mean anything until I found out that the 497th, the Night Owl Squadron, was the only fully night dedicated fighter squad in the Air Force. And that did not make me too happy. But after the initial shock, I found out that I couldn't have been in a better place. It was probably the best thing that could have happened to me. I was the third navigator ever assigned to the squadron, and I was really, really welcomed. So when I arrived, as I indicated before, the bombing pause had already started in 68. This is now May, June 1969. I had actually flown 89 missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail before I actually ever got shot at. Of course, the first time was the rainy season, and it's rainy season. That's really not too much traffic going on. Most of our missions were flying over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, some in northern Laos, and again at the two passes, Mugia Pass and Ban Karai Pass, which were really, really dangerous places to be. Some of my first missions, they would put me with pilots who really were checking me out more than anything to see whether they could trust me in the back seat. And I think I proved to them that I could. I actually wound up being what we used to call the gib, the guy in back, for both squadron commanders that I had during the time I was there, and for the wing commander when he would fly with our squadron. In October of 1969, the squadron started a new program called the OWL-FAC program. We were going to be the first night fast movers, FACs up in the area. We would fly fully armed with flares. We would rotate primarily over the passes. We'd use actually every aircraft in the squadron that night, and we would rotate each aircraft doing initially 3 tours on station, flying back to the tanker, back and forth, and then going in, and then a third airplane would come out and a fourth airplane come out, and we would do that to close the passes down to the best I could. In late October, I went home on leave. The day before I returned, however, on the 5th of November, I found out that my hooch mate and my next door neighbor had apparently gone MIA. Nobody really knows what happened. They still haven't been found. But the bad guys recognized that they had missed me. And on the first mission I got back, I was hosed, as we say. I saw more AAA that one night than I ever did in the first number of missions. And it caused me to open up a bottle of scotch with my other squadron mates that I'd been saving for such an occasion. And we kind of emptied that night. I want to talk a little bit about rules of engagement that affected us and actually affected the war. There was a complete separation between the day and the night fighting, and one could not do the others. And as a result, a lot of our night missions weren't really very successful. And one night I met a nail fact. He was flying OV-10. He was a day fac, and one of the last ones during the day. And he would tell me that he could watch the trucks gathering one by one, moving down the trail, and go into hiding places as they gathered so they could leave en masse in convoy when it really, really got dark. And because I had complained, when we get out there, you guys don't have anything. Well, the problem was that the day fighters would usually go home before the day facs were done. The night facs would come out and they wouldn't know where the targets were because the day facs had already left as well, too. So we decided at one point we're going to change that. Brought in the squadron commander, my pilot, and what we did was we decided we would depart 15 minutes early, and that was the most we could do without getting a disruption report, and we would burner climb using afterburners straight out to the tanker, which of course was not our tanker, it was the day tanker. but he would refuel us anyway. We would then head out to a predetermined rendezvous point with the FAC that we had already decided upon during our discussions. And then we would check in with the airborne command post, who was the day command post and not the ones that we were supposed to be talking to. Now, our check-in with them was a signal to the FAC to contact the command post that he had traffic and he needed ordnance. And of course, there we were sitting there. So the command post would ask, whether we could meet the nail. Nail 43 was his call sign. By this time, we were basically circling overhead of him. We got the frequency. We'd change over to his frequency. He would launch a smoke rocket to where his trucks were, and in we would go for the kill. We did this for 4 days. And in the 4 days, at least out of 2 of the 4 days, we killed over 6 trucks. One of them was a tanker truck. Another one was an ammo truck. We had several small, medium, large fires. We took hundreds of rounds of AAA from 85 millimeter all the way down to 23 millimeter. But when the 7 days were over, all of a sudden, 7th Air Force came down and literally forbade us from doing that anymore. We had also tried to get them to change the transition time, and they wouldn't do that. They insisted we were night fighters. We had to remain with the frag. And so back we went, back the trucks went rolling pretty freely down the trail. And that was pretty much it. One of the other missions that, before that, on the 8th of January of 1970, I had the good fortune to do a FAC exchange on the USS Coral Sea and got to fly an F-4B off the Coral Sea. My briefing at the time was, in 4 seconds, we'll either be flying or we'll be wet. and that was my takeoff brief. We did what they called a bar cap, a barrier combat air patrol, to protect the carrier and the destroyers around it. And we did this up in the area of Haiphong, which gave me my first legal North Vietnamese counter. Dave knows about this here. This was when he did 100 missions north. He could go home. I had one, but it still made me, and I didn't know it at the time, it qualified me to be a member of the Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association. I also got to see the traffic that was going from the Gulf of, in through the Gulf of Tonkin, up to Haiphong, the Polish freighters, the East German freighters, carrying trucks, weapons, and everything else like that, and we couldn't touch them. The one incident, though, that happened was interesting. I flew with the executive officer that night, and when we got back to the stateroom, he brought out some photos of a previous cruise, and he was showing me 3 photos. He was flying A4 at the time, and he showed me a photo of his lead, and he was sort of flying the wing. The next photo showed basically the 2 aircraft in the same position, but there was a big day-glow orange ball of fire between them. And the third photo, the ball of fire was gone, but the lead was basically riddled like a sieve from the wing root all the way back. This, he told me, was an SA-2 explosion that had gone off between them. And somehow that stuck in my head, and I was able to experience that a couple of months later, actually a month later, because on 2nd of February, I and my pilot, squadron commander, led the first of 2 flights of 4 against, it was a presidential authorized mission against a 100 millimeter gun site and a SAM site in North Vietnam, just outside of Vinh. And as we were making our attacks, all of a sudden I saw off to the right a streak of fire, and I thought maybe we had hit a fuel line or something. And then about 30, 40 feet in front of us and about 100 feet or so above us, there was this big ball, a day-glow orange ball of fire. And I started yelling SAM right away. I realized later, I was told that sometimes the impact of bombs hitting the ground near a missile on a launcher would somehow force it to launch, and it would self-launch and go up. And at some predetermined point, I guess it was set to self-destruct. And that's what happened. But that's as close as I ever wanted to be with one. The other mission the Night Owls flew were escorting the AC-130 gunships. These guys did a whole hell of a lot of damage. They were armed with night vision equipment, 57 millimeter and 23 millimeter guns. And I escorted the very first mission of what I used to call the Super Spectre. This was the first AC-130 that had a 100 millimeter gun on it. And as a fighter guy, that was actually much better for us because we could fly at a higher altitude, which allowed us, when they directed us to on a target, we had a much better ability to fly down, dive down on the target and recover. My tour was curtailed about 6 weeks. As I indicated, by 1970, the rollback of the war was taking place. But I wound up leaving with 214 missions, of which 3 of them were in North Vietnam. And as we say, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. Bob, what'd you do?
Okay, yes, I'm still with you here. Okay, I was teaching high school social studies in the Freehold Regional High School District in New Jersey when I got my letter from Richard Nixon in 1969, inviting me to take part in the military. I managed to get a stay of execution until the end of the school year. They wanted me out in April. But July 1st, 69, I ended up at Fort Dix, did my basic training, then was sent to Fort Lewis, Washington, where I did infantry AIT. And while there's something about the Jewish experience, but we'll get that in the second part, that occurred there as well as one in Vietnam. I went to Vietnam. I knew I was going to get assigned to the first cab. Something just told me. December 69, I ended up with the first cab down in Benoit, down at the FTA, which stands for First Team Academy, or, well, it means something else in the Army as well. If you don't know, I'm not going to tell you. It's something in the Army. While I was being processed in, and I'd already received orders from my company, I was to be a Gary Owen. For those who don't know what Gary Owen was, anything that was the 7th Cavalry, 1st or 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry in Vietnam, was a descendant of Custer's 7th Cavalry Regiment. And Gary Owen was the Irish drinking song that the 7th Cavalry Regiment whistled when I could whistle it, but I won't, as they marched off to wherever they were to attack the Native Americans in the West. Well, however, one morning I got called out of formation and told to go to see such and such NCO, get my 201 file and see this other NCO. And if you're a good boy and you stay out of trouble, you might not be going to the bush. Well, I went in there, had a very good interview. I had no problems, no Article 15s, nothing like that. I was offered 2 positions. They said either I could be an air traffic controller. I said, what do they do? Oh, they go out in the bush and they call in airstrikes. I said, well, what else you got? Or you could become a clerk. I said, I can type. I took a typing test in basic. I'll go for clerk school. Okay. So they held me over down in Benoit because the first cab was getting plenty of grunts, plenty of infantrymen, but they were not getting enough support personnel. So they had set up down in Benoit a clerk school. And what was normally a 9-week MOS for a personnel clerk, 71 hotel, became a 3-week training in Vietnam. But we trained day and night, but it was in an air-conditioned trailer, so it wasn't the most hazardous duty. So while I was waiting for that, for the school to start, I was on guard duty just about every night or day. And one interesting thing happened when I was first there. Then President Nixon had said just before I came over that, no, we are not flying U-2s over Southeast Asia. Well, one afternoon, I'm sitting on top of my bunker cleaning my rifle, just like Glenn Campbell in the song Galveston. And I hear a whine off to my right, and I look over. Benoit Air Force Base was just that way down the road. And what do I see? This big black bird flying into Benoit. Well, I knew right then and there. I'd only been in country a week or two. And I knew right then and there the government was being a little less than truthful to us And it wasn't just that Tuesday morning breakfast club or lunch club. So I knew right then and there that we were in for whatever. So, okay, I got through the training, and I got up to Phuc Vinh, which by then was the division headquarters of the 1st Cav. This was in 3 Corps, somewhere just north of Saigon, along the Songbe River, about 50 miles or so northwest of Saigon. I was supposed to work in G3 as a night message operator, where I was for a week, and I saw one very interesting report. I got all these reports that came in from units. And one report came that some infantry company had swept the village, and amongst the casualties were 3 NVA or North Vietnamese Army chickens, 3 NVA chickens. They had done a lot of gunfire going through the village looking for Viet Cong and weapons, and I guess they killed some livestock in the process. But I got moved over to division headquarters company orderly room because the first sergeant needed a company clerk, a second clerk. And I was the junior clerk, but over time, as I became more proficient, I eventually became kind of like Radar O'Reilly hadn't been invented yet because MASH didn't come on until after I came home from Vietnam. But I kind of became like a Radar O'Reilly on steroids. I kind of knew everything that was going on. I had my ear tuned down into all kinds of stuff. I've got some notes here. Let's see, what's next? People said, oh, people later on said, oh, you had a rear job. You were division headquarters company. I said, that was 3 wars ago. There was no such thing as a rear in Vietnam. We were like Fort Apache, the Bronx. We were surrounded by the bad guys. Now, I mentioned I was talking with Alan Falk before we got on the air about the Army had 3 zones. They had green, yellow, and red zones. And the green signified you were in an area that was friendly to the South Vietnamese government. Yellow, maybe yes, maybe no. And red zone, well, they were communists. So we were in a green zone. So whenever we had people going out on bunker duty, every night, there was this one corner of the green line, the bunker line, that took small arms fire from this one hamlet every single night. But so it was just some papasan who got out there with his AK-47 and decided to empty some rounds. Every night, whoever was in the bunkers on that side of the green line had to call division artillery because they were in charge of the bunker line, the green line, and get permission to shoot back because we were in a friendly zone. Go figure. Those were rules of engagement from my point of view. Some other things. Okay, a major thing that happened to me in the spring of 70, when I was about halfway through my tour, I went home in December of 70. My company commander called me in and said, Jake, that's what I was known as, Robert Jacobs. So they called me Jake, or Jake the Snake, because I had a couple of run-ins with snakes, but that's another story. And I want you to pack enough stuff to run an orderly room for about a week. Tomorrow morning, you and this guy from the supply room, you're going to be loading up a Jeep and taking it over to such and such a pad, driving it onto a Chinook, and you're going somewhere. I can't tell you where, but you'll know when you get there. Well, we ended up in Quan Loy, which was our 3rd Brigade headquarters, which was about a stone's throw from the Cambodian border. Oh, really? Okay. And the guy I was with had been a former grunt. He was now working in supply, so he knew the area well. Well, all day and all night, we saw people coming in and flying in, and all of a sudden, well, in those days, you didn't have CNN or Fox or any of those guys. You had all kinds, but you had the 3 American networks, and you had BBC, and probably 1 or 2 others. You didn't have the Russians; they weren't in there, and they were running around filming everything with these monstrous cameras they had in those days. And we started figuring, gee, Quan Loy's just over that way. We're here in Quan Loy. The Cambodian border's just over that way. We must be going into Cambodia, which we were in all the time anyhow. But this was what I like to call the announced incursion of Cambodia. General Robert Shoemaker, who eventually became a 4-star general, he was a 1-star. He was the assistant division commander for operations of the 1st Cav. He was put in part of the operation. And so they called the operation Task Force Shoemaker. So while we're doing all the prep work, and I'm doing paperwork because I am a clerk and that was my job, but I had already gotten a secret clearance. This master sergeant hands me an order and he says, Jake, type this just the way it is. And what ended up happening was I looked at this order and I said, this is terrible military form and it's not written the way a military order is supposed to be. So this master sergeant said, Jake, look at the bottom. It said Shoemaker. I said, okay, I typed it. What that order authorized was, if you ever watched the Ken Burns Vietnam story, which was not my favorite thing to watch from the way they presented things, but he said that about 33,000 people were sent into Cambodia during that incursion. I'm the guy that got to type the operation order and sent all 33,000 of them in. And, so what happened was we ran that night, the night the operation officially began. Of course, we had advance party in there beforehand. Charlie was seriously upset with us. For those who don't know who Charlie was, well, that was Charles. That was the Viet Cong. That night, I stopped counting the rockets coming into base after about 90 or 92. It went on all night. Nobody got any sleep, and there were casualties on base because he was very unhappy that we were sending the whole operation in out of this base camp. It went on for about a week or 10 days. And as a sidelight, the company that I was supposed to be assigned to, Bravo 2nd of the 7th, they were marching up a hill during the Cambodia incursion. And a young soldier whose nickname was Shaky because he was a very nervous young kid, he was walking point. He turned around, yelled, "Arms cache," and took a bullet through the helmet, and well, he died. I have his rubbing from the wall. I never met him, but it could have been me because that's the company I was supposed to be in. All right, that's just a comment about that operation. As a result of that operation, an awful lot of protests began back home. You already had anti-war protests after Tet of '68, but they really went big time after the Cambodia incursion, especially at Kent State where 4 young people were killed. They were protesting what they felt was an illegal expansion of the war because we had said Cambodia was neutral territory. Of course, Uncle Ho never went along with that. But what we were trying to do was to stop weapons from coming and weapons and supplies from coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and getting into South Vietnam. And we took enough weapons we took enough brand new rifles still packed in gun grease and cosmoline out of there to equip a whole division, besides all the bags of rice and the medical supplies and everything else like that. What I'd like to, something else that came to mind while I was watching earlier, sometime after the Cambodia incursion, after we went back to Phu Vinh, one night the ground is rumbling and the sky is lit up. It's about 10 o'clock at night. And we're in a rubber tree plantation area. So in between the rubber trees, you could see it was daylight. We had no idea what was going on. They had begun to equip the Cobra gunships with the point and shoot helmets, where on the pilot's helmet, it had a wire attached to it, and he could point the gun that was underneath the nose of the chopper. I think that those things fired about 2,000 to 3,000 rounds a minute or more. And he could point his head any way, and that's where the gun would fire. Well, a Cobra went down outside, out in the Ville, out in Phu Vinh outside, and there was no way they could get a hook on it to get it out. So the pilot was rescued, but they called in the jet fighters from some air base and blew the living daylights out of that chopper so that it would not get into the hands of the Russians or the Chinese, anything like that. One of my best experiences during Vietnam was a very personal thing. One of the other guys in my company, he was the second mail clerk. He had been a grunt, but he got a real job because he was of Okinawan ancestry. He was from Hawaii. We used to call him Pineapple. Anybody from Hawaii got nicknamed Pineapple. And when he was in the infantry, whenever if they would set up an L-shaped ambush, let's say 2 platoons, it never failed that somebody from the other platoon thought he was a Viet Cong and they shot at him. So here he was, an American getting shot at by Americans. So they got him out of the field and they got him a rear job to save his life. And we became best of friends. Now, the strange thing about it, here I was a teacher. I taught for a year. I had a bachelor's degree. He was a high school dropout. We became best of friends, tight like this for life. And I eventually helped him get his GED. Unfortunately, years later, he had some problems and, well, he has since passed on. So essentially, I could go on and on. There are lots of stories, but I've told about all I really want to tell about my experience in Vietnam. I did get shot at by friendly fire quite a bit, as well as by Viet Cong, but those are things that, well, we don't really need to get into it. Sheldon, I think that's about it for me.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So as Bob said, from March of 69 through June of 70, we had the Cambodian incursion, a secret operation menu, supposedly bombing B-52s, bombing targets of suspected communist base camps and supply zones in Cambodia. And Nixon, of course, kept those under wraps. Even the South Vietnamese and US forces attacked the bases across the border, as Bob indicated. December 72, President Nixon orders the launch of the most intense air offensive of the war in Operation Linebacker. And by a month later, the end of January 73, President Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accords, ending direct US involvement in the Vietnam War. March 29th, 1973, the last combat troops were withdrawn from Vietnam. And in February through April 1973, North Vietnam returned 591 American prisoners of war in what was known as Operation Homecoming. We want to sort of shift gears now and try to quickly, because I think we need to try to leave some time for Q&A there at the end, and ask our panelists, what was it like being a Jew in combat? How did it affect you? How did it impact you? Jerry, you were number one on, so we're going to ask you first.
Okay, I was the only Jew on my ship. On the Westpac Vietnam cruise, I was one of two. For part of the time I was on the ship and not on the cruise. So there was nothing going on Jewish or anything there. My Jewish experiences in the military were when I got back from the cruise. The ship was home ported in Mayport, Florida, which is just south of Jacksonville, which is a Navy town. The Jacksonville Jewish Center, at that time a conservative synagogue, was just off of downtown. One member of the congregation owned a hotel, so we would arrange in advance. We would get a hotel room to stay over on the weekends, go to services. For Rosh Hashanah, in addition to it was a Thursday, Friday, so from Wednesday night through Saturday night, I was in the hotel, and on the Thursday, the first day of Rosh Hashanah, after services through the synagogue, I was assigned to the home of a veteran, an accountant, his family, a guy named Jack Shorstein. Now, Alan, I don't know if you met somebody, but I'm going to tell. But just after we sat down for the meal, Jack Shorstein's younger brother Harry came. He was a captain in the Marine Corps. He was a JAG, and he arrived, and he was saying just after that he was going to get out of the Marine Corps as soon as he could, because there was only one admiral position in the JAG. If there were three, he would have stayed. Now, just jumping ahead to the Jewish War Veterans National Convention in 2011, Harry Shorstein spoke at the convention. He was the state's attorney for that area of Florida. We actually spoke after he finished his talk. Now, the big question, did I encounter anti-Semitism when I was in the Navy on my ship or whatever? And the answer is I don't know. For those of you who never served in the military, there are people in the military who like to pull rank. You never know why they pull rank on you. Maybe it was anti-Semitism, maybe it wasn't. I just don't know. I'm done. Sheldon, take it away.
Thank you. Alan.
Yes.
Oh, no, Dave, I'm sorry. Dave, you were next.
Whatever. Actually, there were only 2 times in my whole military career that I felt any anti-Semitism. In combat, absolutely not. And I'll tell you a story that Stan may have mentioned it before. We had a Catholic chaplain who was out blessing our airplanes every time we took off. He and I became very good friends. He was very close to our squadron, Frank Daly. One day at lunch, he came up to me and he said, "Dave, you're Jewish, and I'm out there blessing your airplane every time you fly. does that bother you? And I put my arm around Frank's shoulder and I said, Frank, absolutely not. I will take all the help I can get. The other story is, and it's again related to Stan, we were totally accepted as full-blooded crew members. They joked with us because every Sunday night we had a pork barbecue. And the first night we were there, or one of the nights we were there on Sunday night, one of the guys came up and says, hey, you guys can't eat that barbecue. It's pork. Well, Stan put on his ball cap, walked over to the grill, waved his hand over it and said, once a pig, now a cow. We could eat it. And that's the kind of anti-Semitism or lack of anti-Semitism there was. I will relate two things. One, I got passed over for major for the first time because the squadron commander back in '64 was anti-Semitic and anti-Black. This was a squadron, a year that 75% of the captains to major made it. Our squadron made 50%, and two of us that didn't make it were a Jew and a Black. The other time, which was very interesting, I was in the War College with both an Israeli and a Saudi. The Saudi eventually became the chief of the American Air Force. During the session, which was the class of '77, we did an introduction to the Yom Kippur War. Yehuda Koren and I did. Toward the time we were getting ready to leave, Ahmed, who later became the chief of the Saudi Air Force, came up. We were standing in the mailroom talking. He said, Dave, could you get me a copy of that video? I said, sure, but it's going to cost you. I knew I was going to foreign military sales to work for Jim McInerney. I said, when I get up back to the Pentagon, I want you to get me an invitation to come over and talk to your Air Force, because we knew they were negotiating to buy F-15s. And he looked at me and he says, Dave, you're a good Jew. You can come. He looked at Yehuda, who was an Israeli, and he says, you're not a good Jew. I can't invite you. Well, when I was up there, I did get the invitation. But the people who stopped it was our own U.S. State Department, who said they would not send me to Saudi Arabia because I was a Jew. That's, again, those are the only two anti-Semitic incidents I feel that I ever had in my whole Air Force career, and I was in there for 26 years. Any questions?
Dave. Alan.
Yes, like I said, I chose the Marine Corps because it was 1 year less of an obligation. I understood that the Marine Corps had a much lower percentage of Jews probably than any of the other services. So I was concerned. And about 1 week into officer candidate school, which was absolute hell, first I thought one night I heard somebody at the far end of the squad bay say Jew, but I wasn't sure. But that night, all of a sudden, as we're waiting around after dinner, a gunnery sergeant, obviously Irish, comes in and walks to the middle of the squad bay and says, give me all the Jews. And I said, oh my God, this is it. I step forward, I look around. There was another guy who had come over to me before and told me he was Jewish, but he wasn't going to say so. I looked over to him. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. And the guy says, follow me. So I follow him, and there were 4 different platoons. We go to the second platoon. He does the same thing. Little guy comes over, Eddie Carfeld from St. Louis, who went on to be a very good military judge. And he says, follow me. And we follow him again, go to the third platoon. He says that. Nobody responds. So he takes us, follow me. We go to the 4th platoon. Same thing. Give me all the Jews. Here comes this big, giant looking, classic looking Marine officer, Les Levy from Lakewood, New Jersey, steps out and responds. And Gunny says, follow me. Takes the 3 of us, marches us around to a building, little office building, says chaplain's office, and he leaves. We go in and the chaplain says, gentlemen, I'm happy to tell you that tonight is the first night of Rosh Hashanah. And since we don't have a Jewish chapel here at Quantico, we've arranged for you to go on leave and go up to Fort Belvoir, where they have services at their chapel. Do you have any transportation? And Levy says, yes, sir, I have a car here. He says, okay, you're now on leave till 6 a.m. tomorrow, and make sure you come back and Happy New Year. So we get in, get directions, drive up to Fort Belvoir, have a wonderful time, services, talking to everybody, come back, check back in. And I learned right away that my fears of being a Jew in the Marine Corps were misplaced, that there was never any formal discrimination that I saw any time through that. And in fact, when I was in Vietnam at Headquarters Battalion, there were two other Jewish majors who were career Marines and had been in law school and had their platoons already. And the three of us, the two majors and a captain, every couple of Friday nights, we would get a Jeep and drive down off of Hill 327 and down into Da Nang Air Base, where they had a little non-denominational chapel in one of the buildings. And they didn't have a rabbi, but they had a circuit rider, usually somebody who was qualified to come. There was also a very interesting guy that was at our services usually, who was definitely an Israeli and not in a Marine uniform, but who I would see very often back up at the flight pad for the some of the helicopters and the big cranes, and the helicopters would take recon way out into the boonies, wherever, and come back occasionally with cargo nets hanging on for quick extraction. And those guys went out with a Claymore and a K-bar, and that was it. And he would go out with them. So I never really found out what that was about, but clearly there was some Israeli contact there. And lastly, when I got back to Camp Lejeune for my final stay there, Camp Lejeune actually had a Jewish chapel in the senior NCO barracks that somehow had been something else and was turned into a Jewish chapel. And again, they had guys more like a circuit rider who'd come and hold services, and it's not we could hold our own services. So I found my fears about being a Jew in the Marine Corps were really very misplaced. I can't speak for everybody's experience, but I had no problem at all.
Thank you, Alan.
One last quick story. We had the high holiday services at the China Beach, the big pavilion there. And we went down there and the place was filled, hundreds of Jewish service people. And we also sat in the front row. And at a certain time towards the end, the Rabbi Glenn Stengel from Fairlawn, who was the next town, Glen Rock, that I lived in, New Jersey, nice guy, he asked if there were any Kohens there to bless the congregation. And I was, but nobody else would put up their hands. So he took me forward, put a tallis on me, and told me to raise my hands, the yarmulke, and he whispered the prayer in my ear, and I blessed the entire congregation. And years later, when I was national commander at JWV, they had a program at Arlington for the dedication of the chapel, or the plaque for the Jewish chaplains who had been killed in service. And they asked me to speak. And I spoke, and I told that exact story. And then after I spoke, I was in a hurry to leave with her Rosenbluth. I had to get to the train to go from Washington back home for a meeting. And he kept telling me, come on, you have to meet him. You have to meet him. You can't go yet. I said, who are you talking about? I said, it's the family. It's the family of Chaplain Stengel who led that service at China Beach that you were talking about. And they wanted to meet you and have their picture taken with you. And thank you for everything. So I went over. They were very, very nice. And they were so happy that I had mentioned that story. We took a picture and I ran off for the train. But again, the experience was not bad. It was very good.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan. Yeah, I was at that Chaplain Hill dedication. That was really nice.
Okay.
Again, I'm going to be real short. I'm going to talk about three little instances. Like Jerry Alperstein, I was the only Jew, to the best of my knowledge, among the 3 fighter squadrons in the 8th TAC Fighter Wing. And it sort of made me a celebrity more than anything else. I used to wander around and tell people that this was during the War of Attrition in the Middle East. The 8th TAC Fighter Wing, the eaves of the headquarters building had red stars on it representing each of the MiGs that had been shot down by the 8th TAC Fighter Wing. And I used to make suggestions that they remove those small little red stars and put one great big Magen David out there, because the Israelis had shot down more MiGs than the 8th TAC Fighter Wing. And we used to get the reports almost every day. despite being the only Jew, the chaplain's office kept me supplied with gefilte fish, with matzah, with Manischewitz wine, with cans of beef and rice, and I was able to heat those up in my hoot. The other thing that happened was one night I was the duty officer. Everybody was up. I was kind of bored, so I went up on the grease board, the scheduling board, and with a grease pencil wrote, "What's a nice Jewish kid like me doing in a place like this, killing Buddhists to make the world safe for Christianity?" One of the pilots in the squadron that came back saw that. He was a budding author, copied it down, and it actually got published in an article called Night Mission on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, in which he described me as the jokey, mustachioed Jewish pilot, which pissed me off because I wasn't a pilot. But that later got picked up and is in a hardbound book on the F-4. So being the only Jew in the wing has sort of immortalized me in print for life. And I did participate in a Jewish retreat. We also had a circuit riding rabbi in Thailand by the name of Selwyn Geller, who is, by the way, now in New Jersey. I think he's a rabbi emeritus at one of the synagogues there in New Jersey. And one of the things I remember about him, I was at dinner at his home once he got back. He was assigned to Washington. And he's the only rabbi I ever heard use a 4-letter word. And I was kind of shocked, I looked at him, after all, he's a rabbi, he's a holy man, right? And he looked at me, he says, "Well," he says, "I may be a rabbi," he says, "but I'm also human." And the other thing, I did duty officer duty on Christmas Eve. Wound up almost getting drunk, drinking champagne with all the flyers when they came back that night. The visitors from the other wings, squadrons rather, and from the wings. And unfortunately, I had a day mission a few hours later. And, you talk about don't drive when you're drinking. Well, you shouldn't fly when you've been drinking either. And my pilot was the wing director of operations, and he was a real yanker and banker. I mean, the stick had two positions. It was either full forward or full backward. And I almost passed out because of his handling of that airplane up until just before the last bombing pass. But fortunately, it was a day mission, and he really didn't need me in the back seat. But that was it. Anti-Semitism. If you pushed me, maybe one incident while in OCS, but I really couldn't guarantee that. And I think, like Jerry said, and somebody, I think Stan said this too. There are people that like you and people that don't like you. And sometimes they don't like you for no reason. Sometimes there is a reason, but you can't always say it's because I'm Jewish. Jake.
Okay. Oh, by the way, Mike Rugel, can we go over a few minutes because we're running real close and we do have some questions.
Yeah, we'll have to cut it off pretty soon, but we can.
Okay. Let me get started. Okay. When I got to Nam, there were only 4 Jewish chaplains in Vietnam, 1 for each corps, probably because of the number of Jewish personnel as well as the number of Jewish chaplains in the military. So for the most part, when we ran services at division headquarters, it was run by a lay leader. And when I got there, the lay leader happened to be the head mail clerk of my company, as opposed to my friend Glenn Onaga, who was the other mail clerk. This was Baruch Pitterman from Los Angeles. He went by Barry, but his name was Baruch. And, we went to services on a fairly regular basis. And finally, when he rotated back months later, I kind of took over, and I got a few people who hadn't been to services much in their lives to actually go. And we ran some services. They were brief, but they were something. They were Jewish services. In the spring of 70, when Passover came, we got the word that there was a retreat. It was a Passover retreat, and I was going to get to go down to Long Bin. And I got to type the operation orders, and my CO said, "Go down for as long as you want." So I added a couple of extra days on it. And the one benefit I had was that instead of having to stay in the barracks where they had all the other people coming in, I had a friend from New Jersey who was stationed down there, and I stayed with him. He was Jewish also, so he was going to be attending. So one night when it wasn't a Seder, because of course the Seders were 2 nights, he had a Jeep, and a bunch of us, all Jewish guys, we went into Benoit City and went to a Chinese restaurant. And I got to eat with chopsticks for my first time. But of course, they were blessed, and so it was all kosher stuff, right? Okay, as Sheldon said. But there's one incident, not in Vietnam. Oh, yeah, yes, in Vietnam. When I went up for promotion to E5, I was ranked very top-notch numbers by everybody on the board except for one individual. This one individual who was a sergeant major of the G2 operation, combat intelligence, was known to be something of a racist and anti-Semite. Well, when I saw the numbers, because I was also the head clerk, I saw the packets afterwards, and I saw how badly he rated me compared to the way the others were. It was just, to me, I don't care what they say. It was based on his anti-Semitism, because he could not like me for, well, in any event, when he wanted R&R orders to meet his wife in Hawaii, they kept falling into a burn barrel and things like that. Well, but there was one incident that was stateside before I went over to Vietnam at Fort Lewis, Washington, that started out negative, but proved that there was room for improvement in the military. When I got to Fort Lewis, Washington, the company I was assigned to, it was an infantry training company, had a fair number of guys from Chicago. They were from a reserve infantry unit, and a good percentage of them happened to be Jewish. And we hooked up together pretty quickly. And they told me that an incident had happened when they did basic training over on the other side of Fort Lewis. The final PT test was on Yom Kippur. Well, they protested. This drill sergeant insisted. And it finally went through, and because there's always a what they call the Army of BOLO. If you failed the PT test, you BOLO'd. There were makeup days for people who had to take it again. They went to the right people, and eventually this particular drill sergeant, he lost a few stripes. I think he was an E6 or an E7. I think he went down to corporal. And these guys were allowed to take the PT test at another time. So consequently, by the time I got there, Jewish personnel were treated very well. We got to go to services every Friday night, even when we were out in the field they trucked us in to go to services and then go back out again. So there was room for improvement. Not everybody in the military obviously was anti-Semitic, but that was a good thing that happened in the long run. It was a good thing. That's pretty much about it. Okay, Sheldon? Oh, Sheldon's muted.
Yeah, well, we do just have a few more minutes left, but yeah, we can try to get
Sheldon, you're muted.
A few of the questions in the Q&A. Joseph Flashner asked, based on your experience, should we take our troops out of Afghanistan? Do you guys want to address if you guys see parallels between Vietnam and Afghanistan? What seems similar?
Can I give as a retired history teacher, of course, my observations are purposely my own. During the Cold War, the United States made an attempt to bolt on Western-style democracy wherever we went in work. All right. And it took us a lot of hardships to find this out. And we were still doing it with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is tribal, and you're never going to get it to be anything other than tribal. And my personal opinion is that, unfortunately, we tried to prevent the Taliban from taking over, but they're just one of the groups of many tribes, and I think that's the way it's going to end up in the long run. So I think we should be out of Afghanistan. Just my
I think I feel sort of the opposite, because there are a lot of the people there that just did support us because we were supporting them, and they went out on a limb to make it clear that they were working with us. And we've done that in a lot of situations. It's parallel to the Vietnamese. And then when we pull out and they're left there, you know what's going to happen to them.
A lot of them were able to get out of country, many weren't. You're right. I agree with you. I'm not 100% on what I said.
If we can get them out with us, all of them might be well in favor of that. But if we're going out,
people who say they don't
have to consider them.
Country from somewhere else too. There are people like that. That's another issue.
Yeah, okay, that's a question that we could spend days on. So let's just go ahead and move on. Joel Hatch asked, are any of you familiar with Mark Liebman, former Navy officer, writer, and lecturer? He may be a good contributor for your presentations. Yeah, I'll answer that. Yes, I do know Mark, and we do have his fiction books, which are centered around a Jewish helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and then it goes on to other wars as well. And Mark also hosts a discussion of books that are connected to the topic. So I would urge people to check out his sessions where he discusses books connected to Jews in the American military. Louis Bear, are we going to have additional sessions? And we will do some more Vietnam programming as we get closer to the Vietnam exhibit opening in the building. What form they'll take, we're still figuring that out. Stanley Goldstein, Dave, you're correct. I believe that's referring to the question about the radio systems for the Wild Weasels, Dave.
We didn't use the KY-28. We had normal comms. I don't know what Stan was referring to. I thought he might have been referring to the rules of engagement because
perhaps that was what
we were over there at the same time and couldn't touch those damn SAM sites when they were under construction.
Yeah, okay, Les Bergen asks, or comments really about the Ken Burns documentary, which you mentioned, Bob. Then you guys, anyone else want to comment on the Ken Burns series and your perspective as veterans on that?
Sheldon, you're muted.
Sheldon, you're muted.
I did that on purpose.
Your lips were moving.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard from people that are a little bit more in the know than I am is that he never really talked to American POWs. He never really talked much about what the American POWs had gone through. Most of the people he interviewed were North Vietnamese officers who had participated in the war. And of course, that was their point of view of what was and so on and so forth. So there were, like I said, I think the vast majority of the military, from what I gather, was very, very much down on that series that he made.
Yeah, if I could make a comment on that as well, add to it. When I watched it, I was particularly looking to see how he was going to handle the Cambodian incursion, just from a personal point of view. Gave it such little coverage, but then went on the other side to the result, which of course was Kent State, which I can understand why that was important, and there's no doubt about it. But from a military point of view, he did not give proper coverage to our operations of trying to do good in Vietnam by trying to end the communist invasion, by going into Cambodia to clean out the arms and so forth. And a lot of veterans feel that way too, I think.
Yeah, I think as a backup to that, he did a lot of the atrocity side that the Americans committed, but very little about the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese and the atrocities that they committed in terms of killing village heads and things of that nature. So that was another point.
I know, just Roger Gove, who was the chairman of the Vietnam Veterans Committee for many years, and whose idea about the gathering the story of Jews who served in Vietnam was his idea in the first place. He had a Vietnamese wife and a child, and down in the Delta, and the Viet Cong knew that I think he was an infantry officer, Roger, and they knew he was an American soldier, and they killed his family.
Ooh.
Yeah, and I'm sure there were many other cases like that.
Okay, we got the last two that we'll get to, and then we're going to have to call it a day. Glenn Marcus points out a Jewish Vietnam vet and prolific author, Mark Leipson, who does a Vietnam Vets newsletter. I didn't know about his newsletter, but Mark Leipson has actually spoken here about Uriah Levy. He wrote the book on saving Monticello. So folks can look out for his Vietnam Vets newsletter that Glenn Marcus mentions. And Peter Shea mentions a book he wrote about a Navy Seawolf helicopter pilot who rescued Army Special Forces Advisor Colonel Jack Jacobs, who's the only living Jewish Medal of Honor recipient. Peter, be happy to take a look at your book. If you want to send it here to the museum, you can get in touch with me, and I'll put my email address out there. So if any of you guys have any last words, this is the last.
Yeah. I see there was a comment from Glenn Marcus who wanted us to whistle Gary Owen. I'll look for the first one. You can go on YouTube and get it, I'm sure. That's about all I can do. I don't know.
My last comment is
I'm sure you can find it on YouTube.
I can address also Glenn Marcus's question. Mark Leipson is going to be the guest speaker at the post 692 meeting on the 2nd of May. He's going to be talking about his book, saving Monticello, the Levy family quest to save Monticello. So if he is interested in perhaps participating in that, yeah, I know about the Sadler book too. Yeah. If he's interested in participating in that meeting, I'd be more than happy to send him a link. And I will put this up in chat real quick, what my email address is. Hang on a second if I can find him. There he is.
Alan, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, just I'm happy we're ending on mentioning Jack Jacobs as a Jewish service in Vietnam. And certainly I hope everybody's read his book. If not now, when?
All right. Thanks, everybody, for being on the session. We will let you know what's coming up, and we'll send a follow-up email to everyone that registered for this session. Thanks for being here. Thanks to all the panelists.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hey, well job. Well,
Over and out.
everybody. Great job.
Welcome home, everybody.
Yeah.